This past Wednesday, we celebrated Juneteenth, June 19th, the commemoration of the freeing of enslaved people in Texas. So, the standard narrative is that on June 19th, 1865, when the last group of people enslaved in the southern U.S. were informed of their freedom under the Emancipation Proclamation, where President Abraham Lincoln had signed that 2 years earlier on January 1st, 1863. At the time, there were more than 250,000 Black people being held in enslavement in Texas. And on June 19th, as the story goes, thousands of Union soldiers reached Galveston Bay along the northeastern coast of Texas in the Gulf of Mexico and provided the support enforcing the executive order. For insight into this, as well as some other issues, let's turn to my first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His recent books are entitled, I Dare Say, A Gerald Horne Reader and Acknowledging Radical Histories. And the latest book is entitled
Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
That is the voice of Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
In my open, I talked about the standard or the dominant narrative because, as we have been taught, the last group of people enslaved in the southern U.S. were informed of their freedom under the Emancipation Proclamation. But I think the reality is that most of them knew that they had been freed. They just did not have the support to enforce the executive order. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, you are correct. Let me first make it clear that, like any sane person, I'm wholly supportive of Juneteenth. I'm wholly supportive of a paid holiday. I see that as a step towards redistributing the wealth on a wider scale. Having said that, you are correct to assume and to say that the standard narrative of Juneteenth is misleading at best. Lincoln, in the Emancipation Proclamation, fundamentally freed the enslaved where he had no jurisdiction. Texas was in rebellion against the United States of America. Texas, like many of the other states in Dixie, did not acknowledge the jurisdiction of the Lincoln government since the spring of 1861 or thereabouts. And therefore, to suggest that when General Granger arrives, that he was telling the poor Negroes in Galveston that they were free, it's like saying if the U.S. Congress passed a resolution of freeing the enslaved in Libya. Of course, since the U.S. overthrow of the Gaddafi regime, slavery has returned to that North African state. But fundamentally, the United States Congress has no jurisdiction over Libya. So it would be perhaps a noble gesture, but a nullity legally. And so the larger story is that not only had Texas eluded the jurisdiction of the Lincoln government, it planned to continue enslavement. Recall that in 1862, the French government, under the puppet Maximilian, had taken over Mexico. The enslavers in Texas were going to collaborate with Maximilian, the puppet, not only to continue the fight against Washington, but overthrow the abolitionist decree south of the border in Mexico that had been passed under the leadership of President Vicente Guerrero, a president of African descent, 200 years or so before the election of Barack Obama. And so what happens is that General Granger, fortunately, was accompanied by a number of Black men in blue, that is to say, Black Union soldiers, and in conjunction with progressive Mexican forces under the leadership Benito Juarez, Ciudad Juarez, across the border from El Paso, Texas, is named after him. They were able to crush this plan to bring back slavery in Texas and Mexico. That is to say, there was a second Juneteenth, June 19th, 1867, when the puppet leader, Maximilian, was captured and executed, and that put paid to that diabolical plan to bring back slavery. And I dare say that that second Juneteenth brought us closer to abolition in Texas than the more heralded first Juneteenth, 1865. Because we all know, as the Justice Department could tell you, that even today, in our enlightened times, in 2024, there are still cases of, shall we call, shorting of wages, wage theft, neo-slavery in the United States of America. And it's so damn profitable that it requires the force of arms in order to squash it. And precisely that's what happened between 1865 and 1867.
If we take a step back even a little further, if we, for example, go back to February of 1836 and the Battle of the Alamo, we learned, those of us that learned any American history, we learned about the big fight at the mission of the Alamo in Texas, but we did not learn what they were really fighting about. And wasn't one of the things that they were fighting about was slavery?
Oh, absolutely. As noted, Texas had abolished slavery before 1836. Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, and the other slave owners and enslavers who ostentatiously named major cities after themselves were not having it. And so they rose up in revolt and set up an independent republic, the Texas Republic. And what do you know? Sooner rather than later, the Lone Star flag of Texas could be seen on vessels off the coast of Angola, off the coast of Brazil, off the coast of Cuba. That is to say that Texas, independent Texas, became a major slave trading state during its independent existence from 1836 to 1845. And it could not withstand the abolitionist pressure from London and from revolutionary Haiti, and therefore crawled into the United States in 1845, where it has been ever since. Although, as you know, there are murmurings to this very day about Texas becoming independent once more. Heaven help us if that takes place. In any case, do the math. By 1861, independent Texas had only been squashed for what, less than 20 years, about 15, 16 years. And so that enslaving independent impulse was still with us. And if we're not careful, it will be revived and resuscitated. And by the way, pardon the point of personal privilege, but this history is recounted in a book I wrote, The CounterRevolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. I know the saying amongst many authors is if you want to keep a secret, publish it in a book. But this may be taking that too far.
And so the reason that I brought up the Alamo in the context of Juneteenth was I was hoping to connect some dots, shameless plug for my podcast, connecting some dots to show a lineage of effort, a lineage of thought, because I know in your book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, African Americans in the British Empire Fight for U.S. Emancipation, I think that's where this is. One of the points that you make is how the struggle over enslavement and the interests that came forth to protect it was one of the leading elements, or one of the elements leading to the development of conservatism in this country.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
did I get the book right? Is it
of course. I was chuckling because I was about to cite another book, which is the Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance in the Origins of the United States of America, where I posit, quite controversially, although I must say accurately, that when the so-called patriots seceded from the British Empire in 1776, a motive force was the preservation of enslavement, not to mention the fact that Britain had expressed displeasure in expending blood and treasure of fighting Native Americans and then turning the land over to land speculators, real estate speculators like George Washington, one of the largest real estate owners, perhaps in the history of North America. And that helps to explain why this country, which was originally 13 colonies strung alongst the eastern seaboard, about 6 or 7 decades later, had stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean, to the point where Native Americans had been expropriated, ousted, many of them subjected to genocide. And supposedly, this is what we're supposed to celebrate.
To that point, well, no, let me. So again, if you could elaborate on the connection between the protection of the interests of enslavement and conservatism in the United States. And people need to understand that if you look at the etymology or entomology of the word conservatism, the fundamental premise of it is to conserve. So, Dr. Horne, to conserve what?
To conserve enslavement of Africans, to conserve expropriation of the indigenous. The whole states' rights doctrine was designed to preserve enslavement and mass expropriation. That is to say, to put it in the lingo of the times, the sovereign state of South Carolina has the right to enslave Africans, and Washington can do nothing about it. In fact, the sovereign state of South Carolina would say that even though supposedly Congress had jurisdiction over Washington, D.C., Congress did not have the right to ban slavery in Washington, D.C. That was their argument. So they were having it both ways.
And my guest is Dr. Gerald Horne, and we're talking right now about June 19th, the celebration, the commemoration of Juneteenth, and trying to set the record straight on that celebration. And one of the things that I wanted you to elaborate on is that how a number of slave holders, the slave breeders from Virginia, the tobacco growers, the rice farmers from South Carolina, many of them, as a result of the Civil War, moved their operations to Texas. And so that helped to contribute greatly to the interest of enslavement in that territory.
And that's a contributing factor that allows us to say that Texas has the largest Black population in the 50 U.S. states. I should also say that Texas was probably the Confederate state least damaged by the Union Army. Recall that Georgia was devastated, particularly Atlanta. South Carolina was devastated. Texas, which bordered a foreign country, speaking of Mexico, and as aforementioned, was propped up by the puppet regime of Maximilian, was able to be supplied, and then many of those supplies from Mexico would be transshipped to bolster and bulwark other southern states as well. And so, in many ways, Texas was the key to secession. Just like today, Texas is the key to reactionary politics. In fact, I've argued in the aforementioned book that Texas is to the United States what the United States is to the world. That is to say, it's like the United States drags planet Earth to the right. I'm sure I don't have to cite chapter and verse on this program. Texas drives the United States to the right. Witness the antics of Ted Cruz, witness the antics of Governor Abbott, who pioneered, I'm afraid to say, in shipping migrants to Chicago and Denver and Martha's Vineyard in New York. Then that was taken up by Governor DeSantis in Florida. So if there are those who are interested in transforming the world, or perhaps even transforming this country, they really should start here in the Lone Star State.
In fact, I could be mistaken on this, but I don't think I am. Another element where Texas controls the conservative aspects of the country has to do with education, with elementary and high school education, because with Texas having one of, if not the largest school system in the country, they are the ones that most of the book publishers go to determine what books they are going to purchase for the Texas school system. And then those books tend to become the standard throughout the country.
Well, it's interesting. The Columbia University law professor, Anu Bradford, has a book called The Brussels Effect, where she points out that the European Union, which has a market that's larger than the 330 to 350 strong US market, set standards for auto emissions, set standards with regard to the internet that then manufacturers worldwide have to adopt and adapt to, and then they become global standards. And so Texas, to a degree, plays an analogous role within the United States, as your textbook example tends to suggest. Once again, those who are sincerely interested in social transformation, political transformation, could do worse than starting right here in the Lone Star State.
And there was a question that I wanted to follow up on in the first segment, and I interrupted myself. And I want to get back to this point about conservatism, because there are a lot of people in this country that are conservative that would say, oh, no, my conservatism has absolutely nothing to do with the artificial construct of race. It has nothing to do with supporting slavery. There's absolutely zero tinge of racism in their conservatism. But I then asked them, well, where do you stand on the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment? Where do you stand on the George Floyd Justice for Policing Act? Where do you stand? I mean, there are a number of initiatives that are on the floor trying to get passed for the security and betterment of African Americans, and it's many conservatives that stand in the way of that happening. Is that too much of a stretch, or are those dots, again, shameless plug for my podcast, or am I correct to connect those dots?
Well, you are correct. And in fact, you shouldn't take those naysayers seriously. Recall that 30 odd years ago, a Klansman and a Nazi, David Duke, won the majority of the Euro American vote in a race for governor of Louisiana. Of course, he disclaimed officially any racism, even though he was a Klansman and a Nazi. Certainly, many of the tens of thousands of Euro Americans who voted for him across class lines did the same. But as Justice Sotomayor put it in a recent Supreme Court opinion, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck and quacks like a duck, you're fair to call it a duck. And just because the term racist has a certain odor to it, we should not allow those who quack like racists to escape that label.
You mentioned David Duke as a Klansman and a Nazi. Boy, that must be a hell of a Christmas time at his house. But it's your reference to him as a Nazi that just got my attention, because I immediately started thinking about Ukraine and started thinking about the United States support for Ukraine, and how Victoria Nuland in 2014 went to Ukraine and worked with Nazi, some would say neo-Nazi, but they would say straight up Nazi elements in Ukraine. We were always taught that Nazis were the personification of evil, and that, the last thing you'd ever want to be or be associated with, the last party you'd want to go to is a Nazi party. But the United States, for a very long time, seems to have had and continues to have an affinity for Nazis.
Well, obviously, you cannot take those claims seriously about not wanting to consort with Nazis. if you plug Azov Battalion or
Mm-hmm.
Azov Brigade into Google News, AZOV, what you'll find is that in recent days, the U.S. administration has authorized weapon shipments to them in Ukraine, despite admonitions of opposition from certain members of Congress. Likewise, with regard to these religious zealots, the so called Islamic fundamentalists, supposedly they're public enemy number one or number two, but it's well known that post 2011, during the Obama years, during the effort to destabilize the government in Syria under President al Assad, the United States concocted this devil's bargain with Nusra Front and with other so-called Islamicists, including chapters of Al Qaeda. And so the United States plays a double game. Let's face it. Some might call it a lying game.
And just to put the final point on this, and again, it was just your making reference to David Duke and Nazis that brought this to mind. Oh, you can not only can you Google the Azov Battalion, you can also Google the Right Sector, which is another Nazi element in Ukraine. You can Google Stefan Bandera, because there are many who swear allegiance to Stefan Bandera. And there are many reports that will say that one of the reasons why the current president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, will not come to the negotiating table is because he's in fear of being assassinated by the Nazi elements in his own government if he does come to the table to sit down and negotiate with Vladimir Putin. Final point on all of this. Last week, maybe 10 days ago, when Tony Blinken was in Ukraine and rocking and rolling in this Nazi bar / nightclub, there were many reports that said that particular establishment where he went to play his guitar was actually a bar frequented by Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and that they had to take down the Nazi iconography that was strewn throughout the bar. I don't know if you had read those stories or heard those reports as well.
Well, of course. And we should not be surprised by that because we know that neo-Nazism, as it is euphemistically called, is on the march. The Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, comes from a party with Nazi roots. We saw that at the European Parliament elections that just took place in the last few days, that these neo-Nazi elements in Germany did quite well, ditto for France. And so there is a certain deodorizing, or I should say attempted deodorizing and attempted sanitizing of these odious forces. And what's sad and tragic is that to a certain degree, it seems to be working. I recall when Giorgia Meloni was embraced in the Oval Office in July 2023. She presides over one of the most violently anti-African regimes in Europe, which is saying a mouthful. And yet, I hardly heard a peep of dissent coming from some of our national organizations, some of our national representatives in Washington, D.C. And you should not be surprised as a result to see this noxious force continue to proliferate.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wilmer Leon here, and Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. And you're hearing the voice, you're hearing the brilliance, you're hearing the analysis of Dr. Gerald Horne. And again, Gerald, your latest book, the title, please.
Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s at better bookstores everywhere.
My guest is Dr. Gerald Horne. And again, as always, thank you so much for staying with me. Wanted to get your take as we sit here right now in the middle of June, in terms of where we are as we are spiraling feverishly towards the November election. As I go to, for example, Real Clear Politics, and I look at the approve versus disapprove polling, right now, approval of President Biden's job approval is 39.9. Disapproval is 55.6. That's a spread of a negative 15.7 points. We can round it up to 16. Is the country headed in the right or wrong direction? 25% of the country says yes, 65% say no. That's a negative 39% spread. With that, let me just start there. And the other thing, look at the battleground states: Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Donald Trump is statistically leading all of those states, and he is beyond the plus or minus 3 point margin of error in 4 of them. So what do those numbers say to you, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, it says that the man who some of us refer to as a convicted felon may be winding up in the White House once again as the 47th U.S. president in January 2025. It also suggests, if you take press reports seriously, that even if he does not get to 270 in the Electoral College, that he and his supporters plan to have another January 6, 2021. It reminds me of my high school basketball team. We said that if we didn't beat you in the court,
we'd beat you in the parking lot.
That's right, exactly.
So, we may lose the game, but we will win the fight.
Exactly. And as a historian, I must say I have a particular beef, because many of those who are members of this particular guild have tried to throw dust in the eyes of the public by assuring and reassuring us that this is a stable so-called democracy, and the peaceful transfer of power is the emblem of this so-called republic. And now they're hardly anywhere to be found as we're having this conversation.
We're seeing stories, and we're seeing some polling data. A lot of Republicans are touting this, Donald Trump is gaining ground in the African-American community. He's up now to 13, 14, 15 points. Black men are turning towards Donald Trump. And I had Dr. Clarence Lucene on last week, and Clarence made, I think, a very astute observation, and that was there's a difference between what people say to pollsters and what people do when they go to the polls. And that when you look at the first election against Hillary Clinton, Trump got 6%, or maybe got 8%. When he went up against Biden, he got 6%. And at the time, the polling was showing 10, 11, 12% amongst the African-American community. So it's one thing to trust or look at the polls. It's another thing to understand reality. And I attribute a lot of this to the Democrats trying to lay the narrative or start the narrative of blaming us if, in fact, Joe Biden loses, the same way they tried to blame us when Hillary Clinton lost.
Well, I don't want to embarrass you, but Jonathan Capehart of the Washington Post says something similar to what you just said. I should also say that
why would that embarrass me? That should validate him.
Oh, I see. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I should also say that some of this reportage about polling, I see as sort of psychological operations. Because if you drill down on some of these polls, sometimes they're polling 100 people.
Exactly.
For example, and then blowing it up over hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Black men. And let's face it, folks, I mean, going back to settler colonialism's origins, one of the most staunch and stalwart foes of the invasion of Europeans into North America were enslaved Black men. And that's one of the reasons why the legacy of disproportionate execution of Black men still continues to haunt us. Disproportionate incarceration of Black men continues to haunt us. disproportionate victimization in terms of police terror and police killing continues to haunt us. And so I see these so-called polls as being of a piece with that saddening litany I just recited.
When we look at, again, the numbers that I stated earlier, we look at what seems to be a very blatant, a very obvious cognitive decline of the president, looking back on that last fundraiser when he was in Los Angeles, and former President Obama had to take him by the arm and lead him off stage because he seemed to be stuck like a deer in the headlights or a performer in the floodlights. And now they're talking about this upcoming debate, which I'll be very surprised if they actually have it. But how do his handlers allow him on that stage unless it's a setup?
Well, you know what Sean Hannity says of Fox News, which has been echoed by the former US president, that when Mr. Biden shows up and gives a credible or creditable performance, as such as in the State of the Union, that he must be on something.
Right.
For example.
Hence, Donald Trump said a couple of weeks ago that I'm requiring that Joe Biden be subjected to a drug test before the debate.
John Hannity said the same thing. He says, you test athletes, you test racehorses, why not presidential candidates? But of course, Mr. Trump is no prize. He's
Correct.
been showing serious signs of cognitive decline of late.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask you. So if you're in a boat and it's sinking and there's a shark 10 feet away from you and the water is, I'm sorry, that was Donald Trump. My bad. So I'm sorry, Dr. Horne, go ahead.
Well, yeah, that was one of the stories he unleashed on a crowd in Nevada.
That was idiocy. And
then before that same crowd, he slipped and said, I don't really care about you except for your vote.
Right.
Which was quite staggering.
Now Wisconsin, he is a S-hole. That's my statement, not his. But why is the convention in Wisconsin? Wisconsin is a horrible state.
Right. And supposedly he wasn't even planning to reside in Milwaukee during the convention. But then he was pressed by journalists and has now said that he will, but I'm not so sure. I would be checking all of the residences he has in Chicago during the July convention if I were a reporter. So the larger question, obviously, is how did we reach this point in this country with these two sad sack candidates, for example? And why is the term double hater entering lexicon, for example?
Correct.
You see it being quoted all over the place. And the term double hater, you particularly see it repeated in the Black community because there is reason to suspect that that phenomenon is more prevalent in the Black community than in other communities. I think that Mr. Biden has not been able to live down his early opposition to busing, which after all helped to get him over the hump as a candidate in Delaware about a half century ago. And we certainly don't have to recite all of the demerits on the record of one Donald J. Trump when it comes to the Black community with this laughable, actually insulting idea he puts forward that he's done more for the Black community than any president since Abraham Lincoln, talking about needing a drug test.
So where do these politics take us? Because both seem to be devoid of substance. We've got, I don't know what in the world Donald Trump is talking about. And President Biden is really just talking about democracy being under threat. And he's talking about this booming economy, which may be booming for the financialized side of the world. But if you got to go to the grocery store and buy a dozen eggs, a pound of tomatoes, and some lettuce, you're hurting for certain.
Well, if you don't mind, let me make a confession. Like many voters here in the Lone Star State, I'm going to seek to take advantage of the Electoral College. As you know, you can win the most votes in a presidential election and still lose.
That's why I
Yes.
mentioned the swing states where Donald Trump is up in all of those swing states.
As Hillary Rodham Clinton could well attest, the U.S. presidential election is really 50 plus different elections. We already know that in the Lone Star State, it's a done deal that Mr. Trump will prevail. So why not begin the long march of trying to construct a progressive alternative to the status quo? And please delete this if it's forbidden, by voting for example, Cornel West, for example, and Melina Abdullah, his running mate, writing them in if they're not necessarily on the ballot. And of course, they will be on the ballot in a number of other states. As you say, there are only about 10 states that are really in play, including the ones you enumerated a few moments ago. So I think it's well past time to start thinking strategically in terms of how we cast these precious votes.
In fact, that takes me to my next question to you, which is, could this very well be, if Joe Biden loses and loses by a fairly big margin, and turnout is incredibly low, because I think that's going to be one of the major problems on both sides, is going to be turnout, that this could be that when we look at the 10th, the 15th, the 20th of November, that the results of this election could be a great impetus for third-party politics going forward.
Well, I dare say that you are accurate and correct, particularly in light of this Gaza war. Let's face it, it's really harmed the record of Mr. Biden, not to mention this Ukraine war, which has really harmed the record of Mr. Biden. We talked about the European parliamentary elections a few moments ago, and sadly and tragically enough, what's happened is that the Social Democrats and the Greens, for example, in Germany, are closely associated with Mr. Biden. They're the ruling party in the governing coalition, which has allowed the Alternative for Germany, the party with neo-Nazi roots, to somehow pose as the peace party, for example. And that's the sort of bizarro politics that we're now faced with. And it's also an emblem of the bizarro politics we're confronting right here at home.
The bizarro politics and a big part of that bizarro politics is the Biden administration pursuing a Gaza policy that over 60% of the nation says they're not in agreement with. And that's not just Democrats, that's the nation saying this is the wrong idea. And not to mention a number of other, I don't know what the number is now as it relates to Ukraine, but you have a whole lot of folks saying, why are we sending billions and billions and billions of our hard-earned dollars to Ukraine, and I can't afford a tomato and I can't afford a head of lettuce?
Not only that, but why isn't there more outcry about the Zionist lobby that's trying to take down anti-war candidates in Congress, such as Jamal Bowman of Westchester, Bronx, who is in the crosshairs right now, such as other candidates, for example, in St. Louis and Western Pennsylvania, Summer Lee. It's really incredible and also distasteful and disheartening of what's happening with regard to politics with these powerful lobbies seeking to choose the political representatives of the Black community. This will not stand. This cannot stand.
You know, folks need to ask themselves why. I think the United States just signed a deal to send F-15 jets, fighter jets, to Israel, 50 F-15 fighter jets. And folks need to ask themselves, who's paying the bill for those planes? This really seems to be a serious money laundering scheme for Lockheed Martin.
And I'm looking at you now, voters in Southeast Queens, because it took a sign off from leading Congressional Black Caucus member Gregory Meeks in order for that deal to go through. And my friends in New York City, they're always trying to convince me and tell me and instruct me that they come from the most ideologically advanced section of the Black community. They're from the Big Apple. But how do you reconcile that notion with the antics of Congressman Meeks or the alleged speaker in waiting, Hakeem Jeffries of Brooklyn, not to mention Mayor Eric Adams, who is in the pocket of the Zionist lobby, which is going to jeopardize his already meager chances for re-election for mayor of New York City?
And you mentioned Hakeem Jeffries, and as you talked about Gregory Meeks having to sign off on that $50 million F-15 jet sale to Israel, then you got Hakeem Jeffries championing the re-invasion of Haiti.
Well, this is one of the saddest hours, I'm afraid to say, for Black leadership transnationally, because as you well know, President William Ruto of Kenya, who was treated to a state dinner at the White House just a few weeks ago, one of the few given for an African leader since, 2008, the president of Ghana appearing on Pennsylvania Avenue. He, in the face of stiff opposition from his electorate, is sending hundreds, if not a few thousand, Kenyan police officers to Haiti to act as an enforcement arm for the United States, for Canada, for France. Although, in fairness, I should say that other nations, such as Jamaica and Barbados, to name a few, have also volunteered for that onerous task. And so Hakeem Jeffries, I'm afraid to say, has quite a bit of company.
We've talked about this a number of times, but those are just two examples of what is I see as just an incredible void as it relates to the Congressional Black Caucus, as it relates to leadership, political leadership in the African American community. And the question I think has to be asked: why are we, as constituents, allowing that politics to flourish?
Well, with regard to the foreign policy, I'm afraid to say you need look no further than the NAACP. Even the New York Times was taken aback a week or two ago when the NAACP came out in favor of a ceasefire in Gaza, because, of course, usually they do not speak out on global affairs, which means that they allow the global political climate to lean to the right, and then that affects the domestic political climate, and then they try to intervene domestically when they should be intervening in the first instance globally. And until we can get them to correct that misguided policy, the question you ask will continue to be posed. And we should also say that this has not always been the case. We recall a time, albeit 70 odd years ago, when W.E.B. Du Bois was still in good standing with the NAACP before he was purged, where the NAACP spoke out on all manner of global questions. But we all know the story. There was a kind of Faustian bargain whereby, in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, the far-minded, or the most globally minded, I should say, Black leadership were tossed overboard, including Paul Robeson, for example, the late great actor, entertainer, and socialist. And so since that time, we've been faced with this quandary. And I would like to think that with the NAACP finally speaking out on Gaza, that am I being naive to think that we may have turned the corner?
Well, if they spoke out collectively against Gaza and Ukraine, and against the United States trying to pick this fight in Taiwan over Taiwan with China, I would, because I don't see how you can talk about one with talking about all. Um, then I would be more inclined to agree with you as opposed to saying we got just 1 minute, that this might be a one-off.
Well, since you pushed me into a corner, I have to agree. As I said, even the New York Times was taken aback by this about face by the NAACP. And one swallow does not make a spring, as the saying goes. And one spirited statement on a sticky global question does not necessarily signal a 180-degree reversal.
Nor does it make one statement does not make a movement.
I'm afraid to say that you are onto something.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. And as always, I look forward to having you back.
Thank you.